Welcome back to another episode of What We Didn't Say on Sunday. My name is Jordan Massey, and I'm here with David Chauncey. David serves as our lead pastor at Westside Baptist Church, and he and I both preach on Sunday mornings, and every Sunday we share a lot, but there's always things that we didn't get to, stuff that was left on the cutting room floor. And so that's the purpose of this podcast, is for us to share with you the things that we didn't get to. This is the time for us to say what we didn't say on Sunday. Well, hey, Pastor David.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing well. Welcome back.
Wonderful. Good to be back.
It's once more been a few weeks since we recorded, and we're trying to figure out this summertime rhythm, and it's a challenge. You're out of town. I'm out of town. Last week, I was in Tampa. The week before, I was in Louisville at a doctoral seminar. You've been out of town here and there. We want our listeners to know we really are trying to be consistent, but the summer provides a lot of challenges towards that.
Yeah, but I think they would expect us to have a vacation.
Absolutely.
A few times a year, maybe.
Yeah, we get to take a break every
so often. I think it's good, or we'll run down.
That's right. But I think we're now going to enter a season, it seems like, where we're going to have somewhat
regular
normal schedule. So if you're the kind of person that checks every Thursday to see if there's a podcast, we can't make any promises or guarantees, but I feel pretty good that for the next few Thursdays, there's going to be some more consistency. We're going to find a rhythm again. But hey, we got to preach on Sunday. It was a privilege and a pleasure for both of us, and there was a lot to say about Matthew 5:43 through 48. We're here to share what we didn't say on Sunday, but we begin...
It's actually 38 through 42.
Oh, you're right. I'm looking at the wrong passage.
You're going to have to back up a week. That's next week?
That's because I've got next week on the brain already.
Good.
People, if they've never heard this before, we always talk about how Sunday is coming.
It is.
You always got the next Sunday on the brain. So this Sunday, Matthew 5:38 through 42 is what we preached on, and we said a lot, but there are things that we didn't say, and we want to share that with you. But before we do, every week we take the time to do a sermon recap, to remind our folks what was said before we begin talking about what wasn't said. So, Pastor David, would you like to go first like normal here for the sermon recap?
Yeah, I'll do the sermon recap first.
Okay, awesome. I'm going to take the lead on all the other questions, but you can begin with the sermon recap. Get us started. As always, you've got 3 minutes to tell us what you did say on Sunday, and your timer starts now.
So I begin with just telling folks what they quickly discover when we start reading this passage and next week's passage. This is some of the toughest sayings of Jesus in the Bible, and there's so much here to talk about. And what's interesting about this is Jesus has a plan to take over the world with his kingdom. It's a spiritual kingdom, but it's going to be a new heaven and a new earth, and he's working through human beings to change lives, and there are billions of Christians, and it's working. I mean, the Christianity is spreading, but this spread has a totally different way of moving. It's not with military might. It's not with the smartest intellectuals and the wealthiest people. It is through a way of living, and this is the most unusual way of trying to win a war, and that's by turning the other cheek. It's by allowing people to take your dignity and not insisting on personal retaliation and vengeance. So I set it up with this. It's contra-instinctive. I know I just made that word up, but it sounds good.
It sounds good.
And it's not what you would think. To win a war is to turn the cheek, is to love your enemy, and that's what next week's about too. And I boiled it down to the idea of a second mile principle. It's the idea, all 4 examples under here of he's renegotiating and interpreting the lex talionis, this Old Testament principle, an eye for an eye, which was a beautiful civil law to restrain judges and restrain to make sure that the punishment fit the crime. That's a beautiful thing. They had turned it into a personal agenda that I need to get revenge. If you touch my eye, I'm going to get your eye. And that was, so Jesus is saying, no, this is not the kingdom people that we're talking about.
Yeah.
So he gave 4 examples, and those 4 examples, I kind of boiled them down into, we're always giving the second. We turn the second cheek. We walk the second mile. We give the second piece of clothing. And we give the second dollar, the second loan when we're asked. It's always given that second thing. And so I was encouraging our people to think of themselves as second mile saints.
Yeah.
Anybody can be the first miler. But how we win the world is by being a second mile person. And the principle that I really laid before them is, I think, the reason Jesus wanted us to go to the second mile in just about every opportunity to have revenge. He says, choose relationship over revenge. It's not always actually going to be a relationship, but it creates potential relationship. And so and my principle reads like this, and I'll be done. But the principle reads like this. It basically says, choose potential relationship over personal retaliation every chance you get.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how I preach through that. Potential relationship is what he wants us to choose over personal retaliation every time.
That's good. That's good. Hey, I was going to give you grace and let you go the second mile on your sermon recap.
It's only appropriate, but I think I'll stop right there.
There we go. All right, awesome. Well, that sounds fantastic. I love how you and we preach every Sunday, and we preach on the same text, but our sermons end up looking quite different from Sunday to Sunday, and I think that's beautiful. It shows what the Word can do.
Mm-hmm.
And so you'll hear my sermon was a little different than yours. Same passage, same idea here. So I'll go ahead and start. My main idea from Sunday was that the antidote to retaliation is trusting God. That if we want to deal with this human instinct of ours to retaliate, to seek revenge, I began by talking about our obsession with revenge stories, Rambo and John Wick and all of these people. And we love these characters, Liam Neeson and Taken. They go out and they get revenge. They retaliate. And we love those stories because we love retaliation. We love revenge. We want it, and as unsatisfying as it is when we find it, we go looking for it again. And so I talked about how do we deal with retaliation. I think Jesus shows us that the way to deal with retaliation is to trust God more. And so I walked through these examples that Jesus provides to show how that's so. And so the first one being the eye for the eye, tooth for tooth, to turn the other cheek. And this idea of we have to trust God's justice was my first point. That if we're not going to retaliate, we got to trust that God is going to set things right. He's going to vindicate us. We don't have to retaliate and give the slap back, because we know God is going to be the one ultimately who sets things right. We trust God's justice. The second thing I looked at is that we trust that God will honor us. And I looked at this example of essentially making yourself naked, right? You give away your cloak after your tunic has been taken. Most poor people only had two pieces of clothing, a tunic and a cloak. And you give that away, you're naked now. And that's an extremely shameful thing to do. But we trust that God will honor us. Now, I also mentioned Jesus is most likely being hyperbolic here and not actually encouraging us to advance the kingdom by getting naked in the streets.
Right.
But the point is that no matter what the shame or dishonor is, we don't retaliate in it. We trust that God will honor us. And then thirdly, we trust that God will provide for us. And I looked at this example of going the second mile with the Roman soldier, that the Roman soldier has acquired you to carry his equipment, and you choose not to go 1 mile, which was the legal limit that he could ask of you. You're going to go that second mile, which is actually taken away from your family. And most families lived hand to mouth every day. They had to make just enough to put food on the table for their kids. And to go a 4-mile round trip carrying equipment would probably take away from your ability to provide for your family. But we trust that God's going to provide. We don't retaliate. We don't protest the Roman soldier. We even go that second mile because we trust God's provision. And then the same thing with those who beg, that we trust that God's going to provide for us. And so ultimately, I point to the gospel and how Jesus, he is the ultimate one who brings justice. He's the ultimate one who honors us. He's the ultimate one who provides for us. And because of that, because we're freed in the gospel, we can retaliate less by trusting God more, which was my application. So there was a lot more that I said, but I'm going to wrap it up now because I am actually out of time.
I just really feel like your 3 minutes was longer than mine. I still feel like you cheated. Somehow your 3 minutes is longer. You get more in.
Faster talking.
You are faster talking. I'm too far from the deep south.
That's right. It's hard to talk fast when you're from Virginia.
Yeah, it really is.
Well, yeah. So So someone once told me that if you want a speech to be shorter, find someone from the Northeast to give it.
Yes.
So,
and then make them angry. They'll really get it
right.
done
That's
quickly.
Right. So, hey, that's what we did say on Sunday. Now we begin to talk about what we didn't say on Sunday, the purpose of this podcast. And we begin this time with sermon bloopers, the things that we didn't mean to say that just kind of came out of our mouth, or the things that we meant to say, but for whatever reason, we just didn't get to. So, Pastor David, any sermon bloopers from you this Sunday that you want to mention here?
No, I don't. I didn't have any that really stood out to me, but I did make a kind of something. I do it from time to time, and it sometimes comes back to bite me. And there is a pun intended there. Is I talk about food that I love.
Yeah. And
so I was talking about how the restaurants that really want to keep customers go the second mile.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's how Chick-fil-A operates, on the second mile principle. That's part of their philosophy.
Yeah.
But I mentioned a place called Five Guys, and I love Five Guys burgers. But they put they have to put their little container for French fries. You order a small, they actually put it in a big paper sack, and then they dump like 8 pounds of French fries in there. And to me, their French fries are delicious. But even beyond that is they are giving so far above and beyond what's reasonable. And but after service, I was invited by several people
to go to
Five Guys. And I had done good this week. You know, my wife was out of town for the weekend, and I was so proud to tell her I didn't go out to eat one time for 3 days while she was gone. I cooked my own food.
Look at that.
And I was eating very healthy. And then I give the impression that I am just a carb monster eating all of these French fries from. So I just want our listeners to know I moderate my visits to Five Guys greatly, but I am open to going with anybody that wants to go. But be careful what you mentioned from your sermon about food you like. You might end up with some of it.
That's right.
Yeah.
There you go. Or, give plugs in your sermons if you have a hankering for something.
Yes,
right? And
exactly. You can use it to your advantage that way, but people have kind of caught on to that.
That's good. That's good. Well, I don't think I stuck my foot in my mouth too much on Sunday. I will point out two things that I did that I didn't intend to do. The first thing was I gave these examples of revenge stories and these movies that are really, really violent. And sometimes I struggle with what do I share. And I gave this caveat. I'm not saying I have watched these movies. I'm not saying I haven't. But sometimes that's a risky game, I think, talking about those kinds of things. But then also one thing I did, it wasn't necessarily, it was a brief little rabbit that I chased. And it was just a passing comment that I felt like could have been distracting for some of our people. As I talked about Lex Talionis and looking at Exodus 21, I mentioned that text, Exodus 21, 22 through 25, is a key passage for the pro-life argument, the pro-choice argument, as we look to a biblical rationale for being opposed to abortion. That's a key text. Mm-hmm. I mentioned it because we're doing this thing on August 7th at the Southwest Campus called Let's Talk About Roe. We're giving our people an opportunity to ask some questions. And so it was in some ways intentional to communicate that and point people toward it. But I know there were people in the audience, in the congregation, they were stuck on that the whole time. They were looking at that passage and they were thinking about what's going on here. So sometimes you say things like that. You mean for them to be in passing, but the distraction remains far beyond you saying it.
Yeah.
So those were just two things that I would point out, and I would consider sermon bloopers. But hey, let's continue with what we didn't say on Sunday, and I'll go first here. One of the things that we point to when we think about what gets left on the cutting room floor, and a lot of it is historical context, things that are sitting behind the text, things that maybe we just didn't have enough time for, or we just considered, hey, this is here, but maybe not necessary for interpreting and preaching the passage. And for me this Sunday, I spent some time, and it's funny, I just talked about how I mentioned this abortion text that people point to. It's not an abortion passage, but it's a passage that informs our view of abortion. But I didn't spend a ton of time with the Lex Talionis, with that command and why it was given and what it was correcting. I mentioned some of it, but I didn't spend as much time as I would have if I was doing maybe a lecture on Lex Talionis, because there's so much there And one of the things that I think is important to point out is in that passage, it's not at all the person who was hurt who takes the eye from someone. And I think that's critical, that this passage had been abused to be that way, that you took my eye, well, now I can take yours. And so the passage actually puts the impetus on the person who committed the crime, that they're the givers, but also, and I didn't talk about this at all, the people officiating, if you might say, the transaction of the giving of the eye it's the civil government at the time. It's the judges. And I didn't spend any time at all with things that we interact with and encounter that are real legal issues. You know, all the things that Jesus is talking about in this example are things of offense. They're things that are they're civil matters, but they're within the legal grounds of society. And so I didn't talk at all about, well, what do we do when an actual crime is committed? A lot of what Exodus 21 is talking about, the original lex talionis, is when a crime is committed. And so I think it's important to say here, you know, we believe, we look to texts like Romans 13, and we say, no, when crime is committed, still you are not the one who seeks the vengeance. You are not the one who takes the eye. But we absolutely believe the proper channels and steps should be taken for the God-appointed authorities to intervene and do something about that. So I didn't talk about that at all, but that's swimming in the water of the historical context of that code. It's not necessarily what Jesus is dealing with here, because he's talking about things that aren't breaking the law. They're not crimes against you. But Exodus 21 certainly is, and we look to texts like Romans 13, and we can kind of build more of a framework for what we do in those instances. But even still, it's important to say, we still are not the ones taking vengeance and doing the justice, right? Romans 12 precedes Romans 13 for a reason. Mm-hmm. Vengeance is the Lord's. How does the Lord do that? Well, he often uses these institutions that Romans 13 outlines. So I didn't talk about that at all. I spent a lot of time. I spent more time with historical context this week than I normally do, because these examples are so contextually bound, and we talk about turning the cheek. I actually brought someone on stage. I don't ever do that, but to show what it means by the right cheek, the taking of the tunic and the cloak, the forcing to go. All of these I dealt with the historical context. But the reality of that code in its legal nature, I didn't deal with at all. Mm-hmm. So
I would say that's the same thing I didn't get into heavily. In fact, I didn't even read the whole verse from Exodus 21. I just told them this is where it comes from, because it was going to take up more time than and I think people understood that. But what I did emphasize is that there is a difference. Part of the reason we misunderstand the Sermon on the Mount and some things in the New Testament is because we don't differentiate in the types of law in the Old Testament. And if you need to look back and understand that verse is given to as a civil law to the magistrates, the justices, the people that were making a decision. That was a civil law. And the idea that I think some of the commentators I read, and as I'm looking at it, Jesus is confronting the fact that they had taken this civil law that restrained excessive punishment, which is a very humane thing and wasn't unique to Israel. It had existed a long time before Israel. The Code of Hammurabi and other places had, and I didn't mention any of this, had this idea of the punishment should fit the crime.
Yeah.
It was incorporated that, but it just shows how over time we can twist things and decide that gives us a right to personal vengeance. And somehow, if the court system doesn't get it, we need to get it.
Yeah.
You know, we need to take that. And so I didn't spend a lot of time there as well. I just kind of mentioned it in passing. And the abortion thing, that is very interesting when you look at that verse.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons I didn't read the whole verse is because people would be stuck on, these guys are fighting, and somehow they bump or hurt one of the guy's wives, and she gives birth to the baby.
Yeah.
and then it's not clear whether the baby dies or she dies. The verse is a little controversial. It's a whole sermon in itself, and so our listeners need to understand it is really crafting a sermon is deciding. It's as much deciding what not to say as it is deciding what to say.
Yeah.
And I struggle with that. That's why my sermons are 38, 40 minutes long regularly, and I hope they don't get boring, but there's so much there. But I do think I spent more time trying to I didn't explain each of these particular events. I took very little time. I actually did this as I was reading the Scripture.
Yeah.
Instead of doing it as a separate point.
Sure.
And looking at each of the 4 examples, as I'm reading the Scripture, I just kind of narrate it in such a way that by the time I get to the next verse, they understood what it was.
Yeah.
And then I put one word to each of those verses, like he's taking your dignity. These words aren't just mine. I've read them from many different commentaries. Yeah. Liberty, dignity, property.
Yeah.
And it just kind of flashed back. Because the point that I'm trying to get folks to see is God, and I ended up focusing a lot on Romans 13, as you mentioned, and 12. 12 is clear. We don't repay evil for evil because God has a system of vengeance.
Yeah.
Then in 13 he says, but part of the system of vengeance he set up is human government.
Yeah.
And so if I don't turn someone over to the police, I'm actually I'm preventing the justice God has designed, part of the justice system.
Yeah.
So that's in some way returning evil for evil by me not standing up against the evil one breaking into my neighbor's house.
Yeah.
Or the babysitter that abuses our child.
Yeah.
If we don't turn them in, we're working against God's system of justice. We're not having vengeance.
Yep.
We're working against the vengeance he says he'll give us.
Yeah.
And so it's an interesting, very interesting talk.
Absolutely. And you reminded me, we'll keep going here. What you just said reminded me this idea that we're giving when they're taking. And it just reminds me, as we think about literary context, just to go back to Exodus 21 for a minute, again, it's just so interesting what Jesus is doing, that in Exodus 21, it's the person who commits the crime that pays as the judge determines. So they took, so consequently, they are the one who has to give. Mm-hmm. But what is so interesting about Matthew 5, 38 through 42, is they took, and now you're the one. You're the one who gives.
Yeah.
And it just totally embodies the spirit of the gospel, that Jesus is going to be the one who is smacked and beaten. He's going to be the one who's stripped naked. He's going to be the one who carries the equipment up the hill. He's going to be the one who gives completely as we take. And so that counterintuitive, or what was the counterinstinctive?
I think that's a real word. I'm going for it.
But that counterintuitive reality of the gospel, that the world says, if someone takes from you, you take from them. God's law says in Exodus 21, if someone takes from you, they have to pay. And they have to pay that's what's equal to what they took. But the gospel and the fulfillment of God's law says, when we take, God gives. So when someone takes from us, we give more. And I just think that's so beautiful. And so just thinking about literary context, I didn't really spend any time with that idea at all, which is really what your whole sermon was pointing to in going the extra mile. Mm-hmm. But that to me is the rich literary context of Matthew 5, 38 through 42, which is both the passage it's quoting in Matthew 5:38, but also this whole redemptive story of the canon of Scripture. So was there anything else for you literarily? I know we've talked about this next passage, 43 through 48, is closely related. Mm-hmm. And so some of the stuff that is the literary context, you may not want to mention because you're going to preach it on Sunday. Right. But is there anything else you feel like you left out, literarily speaking, that you want to mention now?
Not that I can think of.
Okay. All right, well, hey, we'll move on to any kind of theological ideas. I was just kind of dipping into those
You
waters
were.
as well. But was there anything theologically that you didn't mention at all that you want to mention here?
No, I don't think there wasn't a lot of theologically that I got into, unless you think of how people have misinterpreted this theologically. And there's a lot that have used these verses to form a theology of pacifism.
Yeah.
An anti-war type theology.
Yeah.
And so there are theologies that have been built heavily on this idea that we never have any just reason to take up arms or to push back in any way. And you see different groups. You may know some of these groups that they will not submit to a draft.
Yeah.
They won't fight in the army.
Yeah.
And all those kind of things. So I really would love to have talked about what I think misinterpreting this can lead you to.
Sure.
And it's some bad theology, I think, because I explain that the way to understand these texts I got from one of the commentaries. I think Martin Luther came up with this idea that I believe all of this is applying to me personally. That it is when I'm personal, my liberty is personally attacked. When my reputation is personally attacked, or you ask me for a loan.
Yeah.
This is how I deal with my personal interactions with people, but that I also have offices that I fill. I think Luther came up with this, that I have offices, and in those particular offices that I fill, I have to stand against the evil one. For instance, pastor. There are many commands in Scripture that I resist the evil one, false teachers. I am shepherding over and guarding the souls of these people that are under my charge.
Yeah.
And if I don't resist the false teachers, and like we learned in 1 Corinthians, if we allow festering sin in the church, if we don't resist the sin, we're failing. That's because part of my office is to retaliate against the evil one and stand against the evil one. So it really helped our people, I think, to think of their offices. I'm a citizen. As a citizen, I've got to fulfill those duties, and some of it is standing against crime, injustice, I vote against evil politicians and vote for ones that are less evil.
Yeah.
So the office distinction and the personal distinction, my second point of my message was there's a problem with the second mile principle. And the problem with this is it requires discernment. And people want a hard black and white law.
Yeah.
That no matter what happens to me, I have to turn the other cheek. Well, it depends on if it's in the context of an office that you fill. I don't turn the other cheek, and if someone breaks in and is beating up one of my children, I say, hold on, I got another child.
Yeah.
Let me bring them in and let you beat them. No, I'm failing at my office.
Yeah.
And so we talked about that, and there's so much there. These two passages are packed full of things theologically we could have gotten into. But I really would have loved to have ventured into this idea of pacifism and some of the theologies there.
Yeah, same. Absolutely. And I didn't get to spend any time with that at all. You're right that this text, Matthew 5:38 through 42, is often a battleground for the nonviolence versus just war kind of argument. Interestingly, I think I've heard really good biblical arguments for nonviolence, but not from this passage. And this text is not at all about what do we do when someone assaults us physically? What do we do when someone threatens our life, like actually threatens our life? And the best arguments I've heard for nonviolence are actually from the gospel, that Jesus gives us this ultimate example of how taking on violence can be redemptive. And but you're right, this text itself, people turn here, but the smack, which is really the only place you could go to, right? You're turning the other cheek in the face of a smack. that is not at all a physical assault, right? It's the right cheek. It's either a right-handed backhand. It's a left-handed forehand. Either way, it's not at all a physical assault. It's a public offense. So that's not what this text is dealing with. Now, next week, as we think about enemy love, I heard someone say once, I think it was Stanley Hauerwas, who's this famous pacifist, and someone asked him, if you were drafted, would you go? And he said, yes, I would go. But I'd be a bad soldier because my instinct is going to be to love my enemy, not to shoot them. And I think there is something there. Now, that's not a nonviolent argument. You can be someone who holds a just war theory and still have that position of, hey, I'm going to obey the command of Jesus in the place of combat. Like, I'm still called to love those people. And that might involve me taking lives in my civil duty, as you've communicated. But that's going to be my instinct. So I thought that was just a clever answer. So next week, interestingly, 43 through 48 might be, if you're going to make some kind of nonviolent argument, you might want to go here instead of 38 through 42.
I reminded the people, Jordan, too, that Jesus made clear at the very beginning of this section that he didn't come to reduce, weaken any of the Old Testament laws.
Yeah.
He's not reversing lex talionis.
Yeah.
He's just making sure we don't misinterpret it.
Correct.
And so I think Jesus is saying there is a place for government and retribution, and those kind of things are an important part of God's plan in a broken, fallen world. He requires structure, and without that structure, it's chaotic. And the structure is imperfect in that, it involves war, and it involves government, some of which is very wicked. Yeah. But it's amazing how throughout the Bible, God uses wicked governments. He moves them right and uses them for his glory and for his punishment, even of his people. Yeah, discipline.
Absolutely. Yeah, you look at God raising up all of these nations to punish Israel. All right, well, hey, that's a lot there theologically that we didn't deal with. Any stories or illustrations that you didn't interact with that you wanted to share or that you left on the cutting room floor?
Yes, and man, it was a good one.
Oh, man.
It was a good one. I might use it next week, but
so you wanna
it's so good I think I'm going to say it anyway.
Share now.
Because it was Rambo. And I don't know, like, again, it's bad to mention movies because people may run and watch it, and I can't believe the preacher watched this.
Yeah.
But, I mean, this one's 30, 40-year-old movie was First Blood.
Yeah.
And I just talked about how he's a vet, and he comes in, and he's killing all these guys that are after him, and they're saying, why did you do that? And he goes, they drew first blood. I didn't. And that has become a bit of the American ideal. Is we make heroes of people who have this ability. He made millions of dollars on this idea of revenge. But I flip it. I use it at the very end and talk about the fact that we drew first blood with Jesus. We drew first blood. And instead of retaliating against us, he offers us grace and forgiveness. And so he's kind of the anti-Rambo. Yeah. We are the ones who cut him, hung him on a cross. Yeah. We slapped him in the face. We plucked his beard. We took his tunic and his cloak. Yeah. We took his property and his dignity, and he gave us life. Yeah. It really would have been a cool ending illustration for the sermon, but I was flat out of time.
There you go. Yeah.
First blood.
It's so funny. Mine, I mentioned John Wick, but I think there is something about the John Wick story that is actually meant to be a critique of revenge. Oh, good. But I didn't mention that at all. I just talked about, but there is, and I'm starting to see this more and more in art and in pop culture, this realization that, hey, maybe this revenge thing doesn't actually work. And, if you think about the story of John Wick, it never ends for him. And there's a fourth movie coming out, and he's going to have even more people to kill. And if we remember, it all began with his dog being killed.
Yes.
Right? And
started with the dog.
Ridiculous story. This guy's dog is killed, and then now there's going to be 4 movies of him killing hundreds and hundreds and every single movie ends with he's got to do more.
Yeah.
and he's going to kill more. And I think that's actually a beautiful image of what retaliation looks like.
It never ends.
It's this never-ending example. But I didn't point to the redemptive kind of element of John Wick. I just more critiqued it. That look at this revenge story. And to be fair, that those movies are so successful because of the revenge story.
Right.
It's not the redemptive criticism, but it's the revenge
Don't
story.
Don't you think it's because it scratches that part of our heart? We have revenge in us.
Yeah.
And it's a way of us experiencing revenge without actually doing it.
Absolutely.
And it just shows what our hearts are really like and why they need to be transformed.
Yeah.
And my final 2 points, I wish I could have that I want people to know that I didn't leave my sermon as poorly as I left it in that 3 minutes, because I came back at the end and say the only way we can do this, live as second mile saints, is to trust in the vengeance of God and trust in the victory of God.
Yeah.
That He will return all of our identity and property, all of that we have in Christ and His victory. And that's the important thing they need to get out of whatever these two messages said. There's no way to live the Christian life if you don't have a firm conviction and faith in a living God, a resurrected Christ, who is sovereign, that none of this is a surprise and that no one gets away with anything, including us. But it is that faith that sets us free to carry that burden an extra mile and to be a second mile saint.
Yeah. You just reminded me of our conversation we had about when we talked about resurrection, 1 Corinthians 15. The resurrection, our hope in resurrection. Remember, we talked about it's not the things, it's beyond things being made right. It's things being restored, right? It's things being corrected. And in that, we believe Christians can't lose. Like you can't lose. You can lose your property now. You can lose your dignity now. You can lose your honor now. You can lose your life now. But all of it's going to be resurrected, restored. We talk about the Samwise Gamgee quote. Everything sad is coming untrue.
Right.
And I love that. And that's just a beautiful, beautiful way to end both our podcast, but also your sermon. So thanks for mentioning that.
Yeah.
Well, hey, let's wrap things up here. That's what we didn't say on Sunday. Any resources you would point our people towards for this text or for the Sermon on the Mount or anything like that?
You can't go wrong reading anything John Stott. His commentaries are so rich. I really read his commentary on this passage, and he's just so thoughtful about things. There's a few things he's known for that aren't quite correct, but boy, he's so solid, and so he's got good insight on these passages.
Awesome. Yeah, we've mentioned, it's been a few weeks though, so we'll mention again some of the resources that we're tapping into as far as commentaries go. There's a really good, excellent commentary on the Gospel of Matthew by Craig Keener, socio-rhetorical commentary on Matthew is what it's called. There's this shorter, more accessible commentary from the Story of God commentary by Scott McKnight on the Sermon on the Mount, so it's only on Matthew 5, 6, and 7. So we encourage you to interact with those as well. But thank you for listening to our audience. We're so grateful, especially as we've been inconsistent. You've persevered. You're still listening, and we're trying to be better podcasters. So we just want to encourage you to like and subscribe. Tell your friends to listen, especially if they're a part of our Westside family. We really feel like this can be a tremendous resource, not only in just hearing what wasn't said on Sunday, but what we really want you to hear is how we think about Scripture and the questions that we ask, so that you can ask the same questions and think about Scripture in the same way in your personal quiet time and in your devotional life as you study the Word on your own. But Pastor, thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Jordan.
We're going to preach again this Sunday, Matthew 5, 43 to 48. How do we love our enemies? One of the more challenging things that Jesus commands us to do. We hope you'll join us in person on Sunday morning, but then as usual, we will be back next week to share with you what we didn't say on Sunday.